I feel I need to start by applauding each and every one of you for coming out on this evening. But what I'm counting on is that you are going to be an unruly crowd, because that's what this evening is about. My name is Sarah Lawrence. I'm the Dean of the School of Art and Design, History, and Theory, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening. You should understand what is so remarkable about this evening. So for the last 5, 6, 7 years, we have had 3 symposia, one for each of our graduate programs. So one in the history of design, one in design studies, and one in fashion studies. So this is the first year that we've decided to bring them all together into a single symposium where we're using the inflection of each of these graduate programs to bear on one particular topic, and that is Unruly Design. So I really hope that you will be here for this evening, and it will continue again tomorrow. I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about that. I do want to take a moment to thank all the people who made this whole event, 2-day event, possible, starting, of course, with our extraordinary staff who have managed all of the logistics, Daniel Bowers in particular, but also Savannah Kustra, Rachel Honeycutt, Yim Lin, and Natalia Dare. 3 faculty have stepped forward to really do all of the organizing of this event. They are Rachel Lifter, Rosemary O'Neill, and I'm going to forget the third, Carolyn Dion. And I also want to do a call out to Ulrich Lehmann, who's been very important in organizing the Unruly Feast to follow. So again, thank you for being here this evening. I'm going to pass the baton now to Rosemary O'Neill, who is going to continue with the introductions for the first of our events this evening. Thank you again for joining us.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out this evening. The bomb cyclone or cyclone bomb, I'm not sure which one it is. But I do want to say thank you very much to Sarah Lawrence and all of the team. It's been a great effort on everyone's part, and we're thrilled to be here this evening. I want to keep my intro very short, but I will say that tomorrow we have a series of panels around the themes of rule-making, rule changing, and rule breaking. We have 14 extraordinary speakers who will be presenting tomorrow, and all of you are invited starting at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Please check out our website if you want a full list of the sessions tomorrow. This evening, I have the really distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote conversation participants, and that is Paola Antonelli and Jamer Hunt. I'm going to really keep this bio very brief so that we can get on with this great conversation scheduled for this evening with a surprise, I understand, from Jamer. Paola Antonelli is a senior curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art, where she is also the Director of Research and Development. Since joining MoMA in 1994, she's curated endless exhibitions, many, many exhibitions. Not endless, there's still more to come. And so I would like to just mention a few of them, including Safe, Design, Take on Risk in 2006, Design in the Elastic Mind of 2008, which was the subject of one of her very engaging TED Talks, Talk to Me, Design and Communication Between People and Objects of 2011, and most recently, Items is Fashion Modern, which just closed on January 28th. This, in addition to the widely acknowledged experimental curatorial project and publication jointly curated with Jamer Hunt, and that is Design and Violence, which was a 2-year project that spanned from 2013 to 2015. Jamer Hunt is Vice Provost for Transdisciplinary Initiatives here at the New School. He was the founding director of our graduate program in Transdisciplinary Design in 2009, a post that he held until 2015 when he assumed his new role. In addition to his work as co-curator of Design and Violence, he co-organized several other symposium with Paola and the Museum of Modern Art, and I'll just mention 2 of them, on Scent as Design in collaboration with Paola and MoMA in 2010, and the symposium held here, Design in the Plastic Mind, symposium of 2008. Before joining the New School, he co-founded Design Philadelphia in 2006, and he's published numerous articles and chapters, and he is currently completing a book on scale, complex systems, and apropos this evening, unruliness in everyday experiences. So please join me in a warm welcome for our guest this evening.
Okay,
He's the boss.
so I'm rarely the boss, but I do have a surprise. So Paola and I know each other well, and we, in order to sort of figure out what we were going to do tonight, we decided to meet for a drink.
Yeah.
And we had a great conversation. And we realized that
Martini.
a martini. We realized that that was somewhat essential to the experience of talking about unruliness, and this was a program about the unruly. So
Oh my God, you did it!
I did it, yes. So if you'll bear with me for just one moment.
You did it!
So
Oh,
there's one.
perfect.
I'm sorry I don't have one for everybody.
That is so cool.
Wait, I'm not done. It'll take just a moment. Now the pièce de résistance here is that
The olives,
she
yay!
drinks it with olives. And I was in the Provost office with I had olives but no toothpicks. So I whittled a coffee stirrer
Oh,
in the
perfect.
Provost's office kitchen in order to fabricate we didn't have little tiny plastic swords either. So
You only have one olive.
I only have one, yeah.
Is that okay?
That's the way I like it, yeah. Sorry, and then one last thing, and then we'll be on to more important things. Had to protect this in my bag. It's been in the freezer.
Wow. Oh, wow. That is, I'm sorry, I'm so touched.
So, now, of course, the hazardous part of all of this is that this is actually a martini, and to the extent that we consume it, it will make the conversation more interesting as time goes on. So
Thank you. Is it
um,
Hendrix?
it's Plymouth. I couldn't.
Okay, Plymouth is fine. Yeah, it's all right.
Way to make me feel
kidding
bad.
you.
Like I get all this
Come
here.
on. I am
and-
super happy. Plymouth is my favorite. If it
Yeah,
had
just-
been Hendrix, it would have been terrible.
Cheers.
Cheers. To you all. Cheers. This is the way to go. Oh, this is perfect.
So,
Absolute perfection. Thank you, Jamer.
A place
That's
to
what
start, and I
a
mean-
best friend is. Yes.
this is why we work together
Yep.
for these moments. So when we, the funniest part of it about our evening together was that, so we had talked about a number of things, catching up and whatnot, and then realized that we needed to get on to the topic of, what were we going to talk about during this event. So as soon as it, okay, now we have to talk about the Unruly event, this is what came out of Paola's mouth.
Yeah.
I have a problem with authority. And it just came sort of gushing out, as if she were the therapist. And so I thought that we could start there. And Paola, maybe you could talk a little bit about your problem with authority. And just for some inspiration, we have.
Oh, yeah, Mr. Musk.
Yes.
Yes.
Go for it.
Well, the problem with authority, maybe it's about growing up with an authoritarian father. Maybe it's about always feeling that you know better than anybody else. It's just like this ego and arrogance. But in most cases, unless I can recognize the absolute superiority of the person that is supposed to be my boss or my my supervisor, I really have an immediate reaction, and I want to do what I want without asking permission. So my whole history of collaborations with Jamer, you know it very well, was to do what I was not allowed to do with you without asking anybody's permission, right? Design and Violence was that. So the project, Design and Violence, that was mentioned before, started out as an exhibition proposal that Jamer and I presented to MoMA. And, in hindsight, it was an exhibition of Kalashnikovs, and, it was kind of maybe difficult, but it was rejected as an exhibition. And, it happens very often. Rejections come, we can have necklaces, like Hawaiian necklaces of rejections. But what happened is that in some cases when you have a rejection, you just shelve the idea. In other cases, you wait for a better moment. And in some cases, still, you feel that you have to make it happen anyway because it's urgent, because you want to do it as soon as possible. So we looked at each other and we said, okay, we want to do it. They said no. What can we do that doesn't need anybody's permission and anybody's money? And that was a WordPress site, right?
Yeah.
And, well, still, we used some money from your research fund. Yeah.
That was about
I'm sorry.
$1,000.
Yeah, but still.
And
I
we
mean,
used your designers. You had beautiful designers.
I had beautiful designers. Yeah.
Who did the website. But it was really a moment where we just recognized a couple of things that I think were important to what we were trying to do. One was that we thought the idea was good enough that it needed to be out there. That there was, so part of the conversation initially was, do we do this through the Museum of Modern Art, or do we do it through Paola and Jamer and just take it completely away from the institutional context and do something that would be independent of her position at the Museum of Modern Art? And our feeling in the end, not surprisingly, was that we really wanted this to be part of the sort of conversation of the design community. And if we were going to reach that community most effectively, having the massive weight of the Museum of Modern Art behind us was going to make it much easier to reach that audience. It came with certain kinds of risks, for sure. I mean, I think a lot of our conversations in the very beginning about the project had to do with the the very real risk, and I would welcome people's criticism still about this, of aestheticizing violence. It's very hard to be taking on the topic of violence at the Museum of Modern Art in a way that doesn't somehow seem as though we are simply kind of pandering to base instincts around the sort of luridness and kind of dark appeal of something that for many people is real suffering, and for us, who for the most part are people of quite privilege, we just look at from a distance. And so that dynamic really was in tension in the beginning, particularly in the beginning conversations around the project. But it was really the rejection from the board. And the other part of it that was so essential, I felt particularly, I know you had a lot of anxiety about this, was that there was a great conversation over a couple of meetings where we had to discuss whether we would have, if this was going to be online and in a WordPress site, would we have comments? And for you were very nervous about kind of the trolling and...
I was nervous about the workload. No, also trolling, it's true.
And what the museum might be exposing itself to. And for me, I just felt as though probably the best possible thing we could do, and the most important thing that we could do, was to turn this into a dialogical space. That the entries we were putting up, and so in case you haven't seen the site, and do you want to describe the way that it works?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to do it like this so it's easier. First of all, Jamer was right. The comments were the right thing to do, and made the site really quite special and unique. So the way it worked was this. We had a long list of objects and a long list of issues that we wanted to cover. And every post, which happened, say, every other week, had consisted of a little cap, a little beginning that was curatorial, so facts, description of how the object had been designed. Then we would have an essay written by somebody with the knowledge, authority, or experience of that particular subject. And then at the very end of this essay, there would be a question that we would pose to the audience. So to give you an example, one of the most controversial post was the Temple Grandin's redesign of the slaughterhouse. So I don't know if you're all familiar. Temple Grandin, many of you are nodding, but just very quickly. Temple Grandin is an animal scientist that is residing in California, and she famously redesigned the slaughterhouse so that there would be a very ample curve that would make it so the cows don't see what's happening on the other side of the curve and don't know that they're going to be slaughtered, because normally they, in the old-fashioned design of the slaughterhouse, they would know it, and actually they would get scared and produce a lot of cortisol that not only was bad for them because it was stressful, but also would ruin in the meat. So there's so much ambiguity and ambivalence about this whole project. But so we described the project, and then the essay was given to Ingrid Newkirk, that is the president of PETA, of the Association for the Protection of Animals. And she wrote an essay, quite beautiful, in which she said, you know what, if we need to slaughter animals, at least let's make them suffer less. So she said, you know what, this is reality. She took a very pragmatic and realpolitik kind of attitude. And then the question at the end is, can we redesign a violent act to be more humane? And we had about 150 comments. Vegans are really mean, as you probably know, and they were like really vehement. And it was a very serious debate that, in a way, made us feel at the same time scared and glad. Then we had another post that was this euthanasia roller coaster. So it was a speculative design project in which there's a roller coaster designed by Julie Jonas Urbonas, who's a designer that was at the Royal College of Art, but who in his original native Lithuania used to work in a Luna Park on roller coasters. So he had designed this roller coaster with spires that would progressively get tighter and would deprive your brain of oxygen more and more until at the end of the roller coaster you'd be dead. So it was almost like a suicide roller coaster. Of course, very provocative. But one of the comments that we got was so poignant, and it made us drove shivers down our spine, because it was by somebody who's clearly terminally ill or really suffering tremendously, who said, he was talking about euthanasia from a very personal and first-person viewpoint. So that's something you cannot get with an exhibition in galleries, right?
Yeah, and that was one of the comments. So the person, we had a neurologist respond to the roller coaster, and a psychologist, neurologist.
Anthony Damasio, yeah.
Yes, you have such a better memory than I have. She has all the details. I provide color commentary. And so he was objecting to some of the ethics of having a roller coaster that would lead to death. And what was fascinating from this one comment was the person said, as someone who struggles and feels as though he, has to decide and faces the risk of death on a regular basis and the sort of the horizon of death, that he would prefer to have joy in death, and that he would prefer to face it through the thrill and the exhilaration of this experience rather than through this sort of gray room of medicalized human care. And it was a really profound comment, and it was a really surprising comment. And I think one of the things that was especially gratifying to me about the process of opening this up and of sort of unveiling and kind of week by week. So we would post a project in beginning 2 a week, each with a written excerpt. And most of the writing came from people outside of design. Originally, a few were insiders, but we had people, scientists and politicians, and we have
the High Commissioner for Refugees of the United Nations. Just like really, we called in favors and we just knocked on doors, and we got so much because the project was so odd and so well-meaning, because what we wanted to do was to explore the nature of contemporary violence using objects that have an ambiguous relationship with violence. So to give another example, the Toyota 4x4, right? Originally meant to be a workhorse and a really utilitarian car that all of a sudden has become, because it's so functional, the car of guerrillas and narco-traffickants, so always ambiguity.
Yeah, and what was the other fascinating thing about having it online, which really was, to me, maybe the biggest revelation, was that the curatorial process could evolve over time. So what we imagined as our checklist in the very beginning of the project, which included, what was that sort of demonic-looking emoji bear? It was
a video game. It was that video game of a bear driving a truck and killing people.
Or something, yeah.
So it was like blood splatters everywhere.
We had a
very
lot of
pixelated
projects in the very beginning that were sort of designers flirting around with violent notions. And it became really apparent to us after 5 or 6 weeks of this actually running, that we had a very sort of distanced notion of what violence was, and the projects themselves were very removed from any kind of real experience of violence, any real suffering. And so we were able to sort of very subtly, but I think in a really critical way, shift the projects to themes and topics, and in particular to writers who could speak to the experience of violence much more directly and confront projects with a much deeper level of experience, and also with a voice that you didn't often see in design. And so that was really an amazing part of the experience, was that the curatorial job evolved over time. And whereas most exhibitions, and I'm not a curator at all, I just hang out with smart people, most exhibitions, the moment they're installed, they're done. And of course, there's a sort of process of public comment and whatever that evolves. But we could actually respond in real time over the course of 18 months and start to think about how we might want to shape it this way, shape it that way. It was a very different kind of curatorial opportunity than when you just open an exhibition and say, it's done. And so that was really, to me, one of the most interesting parts, because I think I really learned, we had a lot more sort of speculative and critical design in the very beginning, and that was really great work. And the Republic of Salvation was a project that ended up, the comments on that became so enmeshed in really interesting conversations about decolonizing design and things like that, that it became a flashpoint in, and I know this from personal experience, in the global conversation about the sort of political agency of speculative and critical design. And so things like that could happen that we had no anticipation for. And that's what was really the beauty of it. Here, before we spend too much time, what have we got next? So this is where I need to, this is something I've never done before in my life, and no one will get this joke, and particularly no one under probably 40 will get this joke. But it has to be said in a particular voice. And it goes something like this. I have to read it, sorry. Does design obey laws? Aren't constraints enough? Does anyone know what that's from?
I don't.
You don't know either.
No.
So it's from the famous design Q&A that Charles Eames did.
That's
with a
right.
sort of long-forgotten French woman. That was my bad French woman imitation. I'll never be doing that again, by the way. So
That was a
that's
French woman.
That's a one-time performance. Just note down that you were here the night that ghastly impression happened. But the funny thing, so this is a famous Q&A that was done and recorded that with Charles Eames, talking about what is design. And the one thing that I don't have, which I've searched all over for, but I still cannot find, I can't even find it on the internet, is that the furniture company Blue Dot did put sort of a kind of house beat behind it, and sort of created a track out of this interview between this French woman and Charles Eames.
Very funny.
And they released this on a CD that they circulated if you bought Blue Dot's products 20 years ago. I have it somewhere in my house, but can't find it. Anyway, I put this up here because, one, it's sort of legendary, to me, legendary quote about constraints by Charles Eames. But, it was interesting in our conversation about rules that Paola immediately, her immediate reaction was, I have a problem with authority, I have a problem with rules. For me, it's kind of the opposite. Like, I first am very rule bound. So here's a quick test. I believe there are two kinds of people in the world: those who read instruction manuals and those who don't read instruction manuals. How many people here, when they get a new technological complex artifact, read the instruction manual? How many people never do? Okay. So I think there's, I always read the instruction manual, and I live in a sort of weirdly rule-bound way. Maybe different relationship to my father, perhaps. I'm not sure. We don't have to go into that. But what's interesting to me about the kind of unruliness is the extent to which designers feel constraints are so empowering of the design process. And as a designer, you know that it's very hard to do anything absent real constraints. And so rules really actually matter for the design process. And what Charles Eames was getting at here was that in some ways, the tighter the constraints, the tighter the rules that you create for someone, the more likely it is that you can be creative. And in funny ways, the looser things are, it's often much harder to kind of push against anything. And even, it was interesting, even when I came here to start the Transdisciplinary Design program, I had been in an industrial design graduate program, and I got sick and tired of the conversation of, oh, is this project industrial design? I thought, let's go to some space that's kind of wide open, where we don't have to worry about that. And I got there, and I was like, whoa, there's nothing to push against anymore. Like, there's nothing to respond to. Where are the sort of points of pressure within this very open space? And so we eventually had to sort of...
But those are not rules. Those are constraints. Those are limitations. It's a spatial thing. It's not a do this, do that thing.
Don't you think that a spatial rule, a spatial constraint is a rule?
No, I don't think so. No, it's all right. It's just like the toothpick. No. I think that's a field. It's a field that you can be completely free in. And instead, rules can exist also without any constraints.
Oh.
Spatial constraints, at least.
Oh, spatial. Okay, yeah, I would say that. But I would say my feeling is that rules and constraints are the same thing. The constraint is a thing you cannot push up against. So, this artifact can be no bigger than 3 centimeters by 3 centimeters.
Yeah, but within that, you can do anything you want.
Yeah, and that's the power of the rule. That's why I like rules.
No. Okay, this is in socio-political studies, they call it the politics of labeling.
What do you mean? I thought you were going to say it's the narcissism of small differences.
No.
That was Freud's term, not mine. But what do we got next? So one of the things that I thought we would also try and excavate a little bit this evening is this question of designers' fetishization of rule breaking. So we tried to come up with a bunch of words that we thought, disruptive being kind of the word sort of the day, of the year, but plenty of others: rebellious, radical, disorderly. I think we kind of all love those words somehow in the design field, or seem to love those words, and unruly is an excellent example of.
And there was an exhibition at the V&A called Disobedient Objects, yeah.
Disobedient objects. What do you think is the fascination with this? Is this faux rebellion? Is this...
Yeah, we all love rebels. It's this idea of rebel is sexier than somebody that follows rules, and it's this idea of like having something to fight against. So I think it's very romantic and irritating.
But you don't like authority, so you're all of those things.
I know, but the moment people call me unruly, nonconformist, I'm like, recoiling, say, I don't want that label, because that label is so cliched, sometimes. So maybe you want to like do the opposite. You are the really cool one. Because you're so rule-bound. Truly, it's so easy to be disobedient.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Do you think it's different? Do you think there's a gender component to it?
No, I don't think so. No, I never thought about it, but I don't think so. I think it's completely agendered. I think it's just the fascination with the disruptor. I mean, you said that it's the word of the day or of the year. I think it's the word of the last century, disruption, disruptive. But, you showed before Elon Musk sending his cherry red Tesla to space. Everybody thinks he's the sexiest man alive, right? Because he is so free to do whatever he wants. And you know what? It's pretty sexy intellectually, not my type, but it really it's somebody to be fascinated by, because by not abiding to any rules, he pushes the whole world forward. But for one Elon Musk, there are thousands of phony disruptors that instead give disruption a bad name.
I do think that there's I have this, sort of, I'm kind of the opposite of a historian. I know nothing about history, but I have a pet theory about history, or at least sort of modern history. And it's the, my rock and roll theory of history, which was that I think probably the biggest force and the thing behind all of that is rock and roll. Like, I think what it did in the 1960s has changed everything for everyone. And the example I always give for that is, people, so, it's what Keith Richards looks like now compared to a picture of a grandfather. So if you imagine your head like grandpa, okay, and you have a picture in your head, now think Keith Richards. It's never going back. Everybody, and when I look, I have friends, in their mid-60s, friends of all ages, and stylistically, culturally, sort of the relationship to norms, all of that changed because of rock and roll, I think. And not that rock and roll is the greatest music in the world, but I think the culture of the 60s and the counterculture, obviously, is what has cast the mold for the last 70 years now, or no, wait, 50 years, since 68 to, 50 years. And I think that's, I wonder if we'll ever go back to anything that's more sort of convention-oriented or sort of normative in some ways. You couldn't imagine in this moment that we ever could or would want to. But it's interesting to think about because the 60s, and it's not as if, I'll talk a little bit probably later, but it's not as if, these were the first counterculture types. You have the surrealists and the Dadaists. You've had, all sorts of rebellious movements throughout history. But something culturally changed in the 60s through rock and roll that seems to me utterly transformative. And, the kind of Keith Richards for me, is emblematic of sort of what it's like to be old now, that you just don't look the same. So.
I was looking at all those attributes, and I was trying to think of the one that I feel least irritated by, and it's probably turbulent, which is quite fascinating. But 2 nights ago, we had at MoMA a salon. We do these R&D salons that are about topics that are relevant to the world at large, and we try to show what the museum can do to help people deal with them. And the salon 2 nights ago was about protest. And we had some pretty amazing people of all ages. So we had a former Black Panther who, when I called him former, said, we're being called back to duty. And I'm like, okay, fine. So he was quite amazing. He's now teaching at Columbia University in the film department. Then we had a really young coordinator for the Million Hoody marches. We had the foremost expert on Anonymous, therefore protest online, and then we had a photographer that took pictures of all the civil rights movement plus other people. And so we discussed a lot this idea of disobedience, civil disobedience, and we even discussed violence, rioting. It's fascinating. Sometimes protest, which is a form of great unruliness, is not really political, but more of a social kind of experience. Sometimes you don't really get what you want, just to continue with the rock and roll metaphors, but what you get is really what you need, which is the feeling of being all together, with the feeling of being all together and doing something. And then slowly but surely you get there. So we could also think of this idea of unruliness and disobedience as a social need.
Yeah, that's a nice way of thinking about it. I was at a different event that night, sadly, but which was a launch of the hashtag Charlottesville book from the public seminar here at the New School. And there was a wonderful talk about, and one of the articles in the book is about the idea of punching a Nazi. And at what point is it sort of moral to punch a Nazi? And the author, whose name I'm sorry I forget, was sort of creating a link between the sort of internet meme that went around of somebody punching the neo-Nazi Richard, no, I'm forgetting his name.
I'm not
yeah, someone will know it. And at what point does it become sort of ethical, political, moral to use violence? And this became actually sort of a comic video meme and circulated on social media in a kind of comical way. And so really interesting relationship, and he connected it to a philosopher who had himself been tortured by the Gestapo, and who saw at one point during the torture when he was being kind of hung from his arms and assaulted, at one point he felt as though sort of lashing out and hitting his torturer was the only moral thing he had left. It was the only way to assert his humanity in the face of what was an assault on his body. So really interesting relationship to think about. Okay, so when I see all those words, so does anybody know what this is?
Yeah.
When I see all those words, disrupt and disorderly and all those kinds of things, I immediately flash to this. This, which you may not, hopefully aren't familiar with, is a colostomy bag. And it is something I became all too familiar with. And my feeling about the sort of counterculture of design and the use of these kind of terms of sort of subversive and what were some of the others? Defiant and revolutionary and iconoclastic and disobedient. For me, I always flash to, how about you just deal with the colostomy bag? A colostomy bag is a bag that people who have had a colostomy wear. And a colostomy is basically when you reroute the intestine so that someone has bowel movements sort of out through a port in their stomach into the colostomy bag. And the reason I know this is because my mother had dementia, and she also had colon or rectal cancer. Get your screenings, everybody. And so she was someone who lived with this colostomy bag for 6 years or so, and couldn't take care of herself. And so my father was taking care of her most of the time, and I took care of her when I could. And it meant doing all sorts of things with my mother that I never imagined doing with my mother, with all of the Oedipal complexities that you could imagine, and including sort of one moment, and you'll forgive me, Mom, wherever you are, for this story, but it's will just give you the full sense of the experience. As my mother was sort of drifting into dementia, at one point I was home and she was in the bathroom, my father had left, and she was clearly sort of stuck in the bathroom. And my daughter was the only one else in the house. She was about 10 years old. She was downstairs playing the piano. And my mother's in there, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I don't want to go in here. But she clearly needs help. I don't want to be the one to help. But I went in. She was struggling with the bag because she'd lost her ability to learn new things, and she had sort of wiped her feces on the walls and things, and I'm trying to deal with her and all this stuff. And meanwhile, my daughter is downstairs playing in this broken way, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And it's like this discordant version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow accompanying my experience, my terrifying experience of trying to deal with my mother's colostomy bag. So if you want to be disobedient, if you want to be disorderly, how about deal with something real? How about deal with the real indignities that people face, dealing with some of the really awful, physical ailments and things that we have to deal with. Dealing with this to me is radical and subversive and disorderly and disruptive. Remaking a chair seems different in light of all that. But here's where design and violence all started. You want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. You might recognize this. This is the 3D printed gun that Cody Wilson released into the world. I think at this point it's 4 years ago, 5 years ago, a long time ago. Cody Wilson is not a designer. He is a libertarian philosopher and wonderful talker. He is really good to speak. And he based in Texas, and he decided to release open source files online to enable people to print a gun at home with a 3D printer in pieces, a lethal gun. This gun really fires bullets and kills people. And I remember when the news of this gun came out, I was really stunned by it because I don't know what I was thinking. I thought that 3D printing is a force for good, design is a force for good, everything is a force for good, and such a Pollyanna. 10 minutes after having this reaction, I had the opposite reaction of thinking how dumb I was was to think that everything is so pink and over the rainbow. So that is what prompted the beginning of Design and Violence. That's when I started talking with Jamer and thinking about it more. Then Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which argues that our society is becoming less violent, also was published, which made me even more perplexed. So this was the whole beginning of everything. But I've also always had a fascination with libertarians because their problem with authority is very simply solved with denying any kind of authority. And it's this idea of really living a life that is completely left to the individual's way to deal with the rest of the world. So we also had, well, maybe you want to talk about the beautiful, the Oxford style debate that we had.
Yes, yeah. So we one of the things that we decided to do as part of this attempt to bring a conversation into design and not just only have it online was we staged a series of 4 debates at the Museum of Modern Art. And so we were really interested in borrowing a kind of framework that we had seen. What's the name of the company? Square One? Or
Geez, I can't remember.
you'll remember.
It'll come to me.
Yeah, yeah. This is an organization that's been staging debates on various political topics. And our interest was to sort of steal that formula a little bit and then use it to actually have some slightly more simplified versions of debates around some of these topics. So we started off with this debate between Cody Wilson himself and Rob Walker, the super smart design journalist who had the unenviable position of having to sort of argue for government regulation in this particular instance. And after that, we had a debate about that focused on Sputniko's Menstruation Machine. Our third debate was the vegan uprising. That was
Eating animals.
eating animals, and there we had
Nicola Twilley and
Right.
And with the professor from Rutgers. What was his name?
yeah, he's a lawyer.
A lawyer that was the vegan. Yeah.
And he was an animal rights activist, and he was brilliant. And then Nicola Twilley had been the sort of creator of a blog called Edible Geography, really brilliant. And she now has a food blog called.
No, she writes for the New Yorker most of the time,
Yeah,
and for the
and
for
I'm blanking
New
on the
York
name
Times
of her.
Magazine. I don't know. It was Edible Geography, right?
No, no, I'm sorry, she has a podcast. Gastropod.
Gastropod.
Thank you. And then the last one was a debate over internet freedom between Gabriella Coleman, who is the one who's done research on the group Anonymous, and Lawrence Lessig, sort of the lawyer to the internet, discussing what the limits of freedom are. So the point was really to structure a conversation in a way that could get us deep into these topics very quickly and to sort of inflame them as much as we could, and then use the opportunity. So we had people speaking for about 10 minutes each, arguing their side. They had to take an extreme position regardless of their own position. And then we would sort of moderate the debate and then open it up to the crowd. And it was during that time, several of my students at the time were there for the animal and meat conversation, and they were actually afraid to raise their hands because the vegans were so threatening and so militant, which was new for me to learn. But the fascinating thing, if you ever have a chance, unfortunately for some reason the museum has taken down the Cody Wilson debate.
No.
Yeah, it's no longer.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, I just noticed today because I wanted to listen to it, and
I can't believe it. I'm gonna find it out. I didn't know about it. Okay, I'll figure it out.
But Cody Wilson is a crypto-anarchist. He is he actually had been in law school in Texas when he started this project, and he drops more references to Foucault and Baudrillard than a kind of complet major at Columbia University. And so he is, and what's fascinating about this project, and Rob Walker had a really great take on it, that this is not, so Cody Wilson is not a right-wing gun nut. He's a libertarian anarchist, and he is someone who is very interested in using design to provoke very difficult conversations, not just conversations about freedom of speech, but actually wants to provoke the state apparatus to respond to provocations around free speech. So
He's a speculative designer.
yeah, and so Rob Walker's argument was that he is a speculative designer, which I don't think any of us had really put him in that category, but it was exactly the right sort of way of thinking about him. But he is, so the gun is white. The gun is white because he thinks of it as a specter. And, you know, he's referring to, you know, Marx, of course. There's a specter haunting the West, or haunting Europe. I can't get the quote right. But he wanted it spectral in its physical form so that it would have this kind of ghost-like quality in terms of its haunting of sort of the state apparatus and the ability of the state to track and to identify and to surveil and to regulate. And so the project was really meant as this remarkably erudite intervention into the state apparatus through the sort of medium of guns. And he's more complicated than you could imagine because he is a bit of a gun nut, but he's a gun nut because it's sort of the wedge that's most effective at being unruly. And so he uses that to kind of provoke. So it was a super fascinating conversation.
More than unruly, he's a-ruly.
Yeah.
Very, I mean, talking about Cody tonight is very appropriate because he's a fascinating individual. And in a way, it's Elon Musk without that much money and living in Texas. And you know what I'm saying? It's just the same kind of person.
Yeah, and yet, you know, you can admire it up to a point, and then it's a gun. You know, it's a gun, it's a gun, it's a gun. And can you live with that? Did it have to be a gun? Could it have been something else? And he also did Dark Wallet, which was a kind of cryptocurrency way of sort of evading the authorities in terms of exchanging value and bitcoins and other things. So the gun was not his only thing, but nonetheless. So what we're going to do now, so our provocation tonight was to have a conversation. It's a little bit awkward to stage a conversation, right? You know, how do you have a conversation without just boring everybody or talking about, you know, old times or something, which we seem to be doing. So what we decided to do was kind of identify a few objects that we thought were of particular interest that had a certain purchase on the notion of unruliness, and then to use that to sort of structure our conversation. But one of the things we also wanted to try, and this is an experiment and it may fail badly, but it's worth a try. We're going to go through some objects, the gun being the first one. If you have an unruly object that you think is really fascinating to discuss and are willing to kind of launch it at us and discuss it with us, that's the hashtag. Find a picture of it, send it there. And what we're going to try and do is then, with hopefully some help, is check our feed once we've gone through some of this discussion and use that as an opportunity to have a conversation with you about the things that you think are particularly unruly, disobedient, that provoke certain kind of interesting conversations for design. That's what we tried to do through the sort of selection of objects that we're going to talk about next. But we want you to be part of that conversation. So throw them up there. Do a little search on your phone. Most of you are on your phone already. So, you know, it's 2 clicks away. Find your favorite object. Because that'll be it'll be a lot easier than if you were to say, oh, yeah, I saw this at the V&A. It was like 2007. It was red, kind of square. You know, that's not going to be much help. But if you can, you know, show it to us, then we can really discuss it. So start your engines. Start tweeting at us. So you just did a show on fashion.
Yeah. Well, it was not. Yeah,
It's not on fashion. It's on design. You did a show on design. Yeah.
No, the hoodie is not unruly unto itself, but the hoodie can be used in many different ways. I mean, recently it's very tragic how it's become a political symbol, but in itself it had an interesting moment. So hooded garments have existed for centuries, but in the 20th century they were kind of repurposed when kind of cotton jerseys became really available to all by a company called Knickerbocker Knitting Company, which is the company that's now called Champion. And they started repurposing in the 1930s these hooded and zipped sometimes clothes for athletes to keep them warm either before or after training. And after that, cold storage workers and construction workers picked them up. And then athletes in colleges, their girlfriends, so they become preppy wear. So they had this like life that went on until in the 1980s, they were adopted widely by kids in cities. In order to both be comfortable and also be anonymous sometimes. So skateboarders on the West Coast, when they closed parks, used to skate in illegal places with the hood up, or graffiti writers everywhere, b-boys. So it became this slightly symbol of unruliness until it became the tragic symbol of injustice and vigilantism. But it has this double-edged nature to itself.
Yeah, it is a really fascinating artifact. Also, I don't know if I forget when you came and when all this happened, but for those of us of a certain generation, the first sort of outlaw hoodie wearer was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. For a lot of us, that there was the FBI drawing that showed him with sunglasses on and a hooded sweatshirt on, and that's interesting from a kind of outlaw perspective. That was kind of, for me, an iconic moment in the, it was probably the 1980s, I would guess. Someone can tell us.
I think it was like super early 90s.
Was it? Okay. I have no idea. But then obviously the hoodie then becomes this very interesting kind of almost like liminal garment where someone uses it to be both public and private at the same time. And that's what's so interesting. And it's also a way to sort of hide the body and to hide the color of the body. And so people with brown and black skin were wearing hoodies in part to be less visible, to be less victims of police harassment, to get through the city as a means of getting through the city without being surveilled, without being harassed, without being stopped and frisked, as happened here, invented in New York City, and fortunately Donald Trump hasn't yet revived it, despite his promises. So then it has this kind of really interesting modern incarnation as this garment of kind of almost like an invisibility cloak if you have read Harry Potter or read it to your kids, as I have. And so it becomes this way of disappearing in public. And then, of course, with Trayvon Martin, it becomes a sign of protest. And yet it also is still a way of evading surveillance. It is a way to, we live now at a time where one is constantly in some sort of relative proximity to a camera. And so this becomes a way of hiding in public sight, of kind of keeping your face hidden.
What is this? Oh, architecture without architects. Yeah.
Yes.
Of course, this is great. Yeah, I didn't recognize it for a moment. So, Architecture Without Architects was an exhibition in 1964 at MoMA that was curated by Bernard Rudofsky. Bernard Rudofsky was this cantankerous and really curmudgeonly and forever rebellious architect, curator, and anthropologist who did also an exhibition before that was about fashion in 1944. But in 1964, when modernist architecture started to reveal a dark side and so many peripheries and projects had been built with that kind of modernist rule and style, he decided to really punch modernist architects in the stomach by doing an exhibition that was all black and white pictures of vernacular dwellings, of mud huts, of cave dwellings in Italy, in the city of Matera. So all the architecture that came not from the star architect of the time and a big name and a big ego, but rather from material cultures and centuries of like good use of local resources.
Yeah, and so this is the Dogon tribe in the Sudan. And this is an overhead picture of Marrakesh, And so you have an amazing sense of a kind of nonlinear order in this that has, as much to say about contemporary architecture as any sort of, computer rendering might. So then
I'll let you talk about this.
So I got to, I had the singular pleasure of moderating the debate at the Museum of Modern Art and we use this project, the Menstruation Machine, as the sort of provocation. This is by Sputniko. And as an aside, Sputniko, as a couple of others that we're going to feature tonight, are students of Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby. And I think, for me at least, it's hard to talk about unruliness without also talking about the sort of sublime and subtle way in which the work that they did and the students' work that they helped to support has managed to change the conversation in design in a way that was different from criticism. Because in some ways for designers, I think they could look at criticism and say, well, that's some smarty pants who thinks they know it all, but that's not a designer. Whereas I think what Tony and Fiona did was said, we can use design to criticize design and to challenge design. And that was really a sort of revolutionary stance that, to my continuing surprise, I can't tell you how many different worlds I'm in now that are unrelated to design, where notions of speculation and speculative thinking, et cetera, have become normative. Just an incredible index of their popularity. But so I got to moderate this debate, and it was really exciting for me because, as I had said at the time, only in my dreams did I, as a young boy growing up in a small town in New Hampshire, think that I would be moderating a debate about menstruation at the Museum of Modern Art. It was a moment I had always dreamed of as a young boy. But this is a project by Sputniko, who is a pop star in Japan and an incredible designer. And this was a machine that you could attach that would provide, through electrodes, would provide pressure on your abdomen and would also leak a blood-like substance. And so that anybody who was not accustomed to having their period could actually experience that. And then what was interesting as well about the project was that the video that accompanies it had her as a boy trying on this machine and experiencing it as a female playing a male, experiencing a female's menstruation and period pain. So there was a wonderful kind of slipperiness of the gender dynamics as well. I realize from time we're going to have to move quickly.
So this is Ray Kawakubo, and it's a Comme des Garçons collection from 1998 called Body Meets Dress, Dress Meets Body, that was also called familiarly by the fashion world the Lumps and Bumps collection. And it was wonderful because it was really a jolt to the system of so many people in fashion. You know how we always have this idea of bodies being perfect and fashion fitting perfect bodies that in reality are anorexic and ever the same. And instead, Kawakubo said, no, bodies can be completely deformed. They can have lumps and bumps and still be beautiful. And the impression was so strong that I do believe firmly that to this day, when we go and buy a piece at H&M or anywhere else, we are carrying a little DNA trace of this collection because it influenced so many others. And Kawakubo, was forever the unruly one and still is. And so are many of other fashion designers from Japan that really changed the world in the early 1980s. And then, of course, we know that Antwerp and the designers from Belgium came later. But this is one of the first original unruly designs.
You probably don't know this, but this is one of my 2 favorite designs of all time.
No, I didn't know that. This was included in items.
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. This just shocked me in all the best ways. And one of the reasons is that I love Gingham. I think I have an issue with Gingham that I probably shouldn't talk about. But there is a wonderful quote from the French philosopher Georges Bataille, who in a different life I did a lot of work on, in talking about the place that design and art could go to. And he says, I challenge any lover of a painting to adore a canvas as much as a fetishist loves a shoe. And it's a great line. And, this is a fetish for me. And it's a fetish in part because of the Gingham. And the disrupting of the grid. So from, you think of much of modernist design can be reduced to the notion of the grid. And here is this sort of stretching and deforming of the grid, and this just challenging of the kind of deep normativism of what fashion is and should look like. And yet it's just so visually stunning. I love this. My second favorite piece, just which I forgot to include tonight, was the MIT Press logo that was done by Muriel Cooper. So very different. All right, we'll keep moving. So I didn't do the Ai Hasegawa project that you thought of. I did instead Ai Hasegawa's I Want to Deliver a Dolphin. Do you know this project? You must.
I do know this project, yes, and I
You have it
know
in the collection?
I saw no,
No.
but I saw like 10 days ago, and she's working on a new project that involves sharks. But yes,
So she's a student of Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby, and this was a project where she imagined sort of the context of the eradication of species, the need to protect certain species, the challenges of eating meat, the challenges of using protein to sustain our population. And so she built a project around the fantasy of giving birth to a dolphin. And to what's called a Maui dolphin, which is an endangered species, very small, about the same size as a human fetus, or a newborn, and explored to me like the incredibly terrifying vision of what hopefully is not possible, but something that we seem to be stumbling into somehow. So really fascinating project.
this is Emiliana Design. These are Emily and Emiliana. They're based in Barcelona, and they are amazing designers. Do you also have the Intra-Toe candy?
No, I didn't.
No, okay,
Sorry.
that's all right.
Yeah.
So these are two designs by them. So you've seen the tampon that is like a finger, and this is a dish that has a hair that is like painted on it. They also designed this beautiful candy that you're supposed to put between your toes, and your lover is supposed to suck it from your toes. So they're just amazing, because if you think about it, it's pretty easy to do shocking design, but this kind of subtlety and irony and at the same time disturbance is hard to come by. And they are quite unique that way, but also they're quite Spanish. You know, I find that Spain has that vein of surrealism of the good kind. I think that surrealism is a little bit like cholesterol. There's the good and the bad kind, and you know, in some cases, like in the case of Pedro Almodovar or them, it's the good kind. So Emiliana are really great.
And you were very polite. This is a pubic hair, not a hair.
You're right. I forgot. Pubic.
And it, again, sort of disrupting the modernist fantasy of this kind of clean white space.
Definitely pubic. You're right.
With the kind of return of the repressed, of the body's sort of, leaking. There's a really interesting theme that came up in the projects that we chose, which had to do with the female body. I think we were sort of just riffing on each other and thinking about the ways, this project, that project. Then as I was collecting them together for this.
I realized that. Emiliana also did chocolate nipples.
Yes.
So they're like chocolates, but they're in the shape of nipples. Yeah, and this woman, see, I said it really very spontaneously. It was not a joke, so that says a lot. But this is Erica. She's a humanoid by Professor Hiroshi Ishiguro, who is at the University of Osaka and studies relationships between humans and robots. So he studies relationships. He doesn't study robots, which is very fascinating. And his humanoids tend to be either perfect replicas of people that are alive or even that are about to die. He did one for this particular master of the tea ceremony that passed away, and so now the humanoid does the tea ceremony and explains the tea ceremony in his place. Or sometimes they are fictional characters. This is Erica. And Erica is his most recent humanoids. Right now, you can have a conversation with her that is a little bit scripted, but they're trying to adapt her to have artificial intelligence. So at one point, she'll be able to converse with you. And it's a company humanoid. So it's about keeping you company.
So this is a very famous photograph in some ways. This was submitted to a photographic competition in the category of portraiture. And there was a very interesting conversation around whether the photograph of a non-human could be portraiture. And so this is from a series by a Finnish photographer named Maija Tammi, and it's from a series called One of Them is Human. And these are a series of photographs of various kinds of androids.
So is this Erica?
Yes.
Oh, it is Erica,
Yeah.
because I recognized her, but I didn't know it was that photographer. See, I mean, this is uncanny. About 10 days ago, I was in Osaka interviewing Erica for a video series. And when I saw this picture, I recognized Erica, but I didn't realize that it was like a photographer that had taken a portrait.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting to think about what, even the challenge to something as, sort of non-charged as portrait photography. And yet here we have this picture that has to kind of undermine the categories, because we have to ask, is this a portrait? Can a non-human be a portrait within the kind of conventions of portrait photography? So here we go, some little change in pace. So this is a famous letter that was sent. And what's famous about it is two things. One, it was sent by the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers basketball team. It was an angry letter that he wrote because his star, who had been raised in Akron, Ohio, outside of Cleveland, and who was the biggest basketball player in the world, LeBron James, had recently, in a very kind of media blitz, strange new ritual, had declared that he was going to take his talents to Miami. He was leaving the Cleveland Cavaliers, and he was moving to Miami Beach and going to be on the Miami Heat. What's notable about this is Comic Sans. He set the letter in Comic Sans. And so you have this letter that's full of things like, the good news is that the ownership team and the rest of the hardworking, loyal, and driven staff over here at your hometown Cavaliers have not betrayed you, nor never will betray you in Comic Sans. And it's, just this kind of incredible moment where this typeface takes on this kind of perverse life of like, did he know Comic Sans? Did he understand the semantics of Comic Sans? Like, why did he write the angriest letter from a billionaire and set it in Comic Sans? Like, what was going through this guy's mind? He owns Quicken Loans Company, which is a payday loan company, a slightly kind of skeevy business to begin with, and has made millions off of basically poor people. But he was outraged. He was outraged that his superstar, the King James as his nickname, LeBron James, had left. And so he sends the angriest letter in Comic Sans.
I wonder what de Blasio is going to do to the superintendent of the schools of Miami. What kind of typeface he's going to use.
Yeah, right. And one of the reasons this came up as well is that when Paola had organized and curated the Design in the Elastic Mind exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, we worked together on the symposium. And there were examples of two brilliant scientists, one of whom, and you remember his name at Princeton, he was the Albert Einstein chair of astrophysics or something. And basically what he did during the day was try and figure out the origin of the universe through math. And he puts up his presentation, and guess what typeface is in? Comic Sans.
I know, scientists are a disaster. I know, right?
And so there's this funny way in which, I think he felt like, nobody's going to understand me.
Let's tone it down.
Let's make it friendly. Let's put it in Comic Sans. So I love the weird, and now no designer can use Comic Sans without sort of, it being so ironic as to be uninteresting.
So once I was asked by, one of those silly questionnaires by magazines, what is the sexiest object? And I said, well, it's the beanbag chair because it comes in thousands of positions. I mean, it's like, what do you want to say? But truly, the beanbag chair, which is not called beanbag, it's called sacco, which means bag chair, was designed by three Italian designers in 1968. And it's forever been my favorite furniture piece. truly, because you can sit any way you want, you can sleep in it, you can take it around. But when it was released into the world in 1968, it was, you would see pictures of it in the advertising campaigns with these kind of like long hair types, smoking joints and talking probably Marxist theory on it. So it was this idea of really the emblem of 1968. And even though I consider it much more, pretty and aesthetically pleasing than the way it was portrayed at that time, it has maintained that kind of rebellious streak, at least for me.
And it is for me, again, without revealing my sort of fascination with Georges Bataille, it's an example of formlessness, of the chair sort of, starting to lose its form completely. It just becomes sort of a skin that holds a series of particulate elements that don't really make a chair. None of it is really the form of a chair at all, but Bataille and also Yves Bois, who wrote, along with Rosalind Krauss, did an exhibition called Formless, talk about the idea of the formless as declassifying use and beauty. And so this doesn't fit the form. It never has one shape. It doesn't have any of the kind of sophisticated modernist notions of form and proportion and line and all the things that give form. And it has this, it's lumpen.
It has a problem with authority.
It has a problem with authority. Yeah, so I want to get on to our, can we skip this one?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, because we talked about this, Temple Grandin's serpentine ramp. So this was the one that kills animals humanely. And I should say, with Design and Violence, as Paola mentioned, the comments on the section for the serpentine ramp, over 150 comments. We ended, the very last post on Design and Violence was about the euthanasia cocktail. In other words, the three chemicals that are used together.
Lethal injection.
Lethal injection, thank you. The lethal injection cocktail, which was the three chemicals that are used in combination for state-sponsored murder, for lethal injection. And we had, quite amazingly, speaking back to this cocktail was Ricky Jackson, who had only recently been released from incarceration due to DNA proof that had shown that he was innocent. He had been in for 30 years.
Yeah, death row for 30 years.
And on death row, and was in quite amazing detail describing what life is like when death hangs over you. Temple Grandin's serpentine ramp elicited 150 comments. How many did Ricky Jackson, a human who faced death, how many comments did he get? 3. 3. Kill an animal? 150 comments. Kill a human? 3. It's an amazing, strange, unexplainable way to end, I thought, Design and Violence. It was our last post. We made it about death for a reason. It was not, I mean, it was intentional. But it was just shocking to me that, here was this eloquent sort of rebuttal to this, barbaric process from someone who had given his life, incorrectly because of the color of his skin, and yet all 3 people commented. But you kill an animal and you get 150. And finally, this is me. I just abhor stock photography. One of the things we never quite got to in Design and Violence, but I always wanted to, was and don't steal this idea, please, nobody out there, which is I wanted to do an exhibition of stock photography of the term violence, because it returns the most ridiculous imagery that you could imagine. Like, what does a stock photograph of violence look like? And so there are, it's an amazing.
It was hilarious.
Amazing sort of exploration of all of the weird ways.
Showing of teeth.
Corporate America tries to sanitize but also depict violence. But I love this angry mob, I added unruly, this unruly mob, because it looks so not, it's like middle managers with clubs, like watch out. But here are the credits for those, we talked through a lot of different projects.
In Comic Sans.
set, of course, in Comic Sans, but in case you didn't get it, take a picture quickly, because now we're going to try our experiment. So, oh, wait, okay, go back. All right, hold on, take your pictures, come on, everyone. All right. Cameras down. All right, have we got, have you been following the feed at all, or? One post, all right.
Okay, I hope it's juicy. Huh?
There's 2 Instagram,
Oh,
and I guess 1 tweet. Is this?
What is that? The mark?
stock market crash. Is that right? October, oh wait, so that's the Great Recession. So who suggested this image, if you don't mind? Can you explain some more? Jonas, since I know you.
I don't know. I was wondering what you guys think of
Of the stock exchange or of the
system which is like surrounded, or which is surrounding the stock exchange, and then also what sort of speculation that might be in comparison to speculative design.
Well, it's funny that you posted this graph.
This graphic gave birth to the R&D department that I run at MoMA. It's half of me and a 12-month intern, but we do a lot. And it started out because I have always had a chip on my shoulder. I did 2 years of economics before switching to architecture, and I left economics because it seemed crazy to me. At that time, behavioral economics did not exist, so everything was presented with diagrams as if it were an exact science, while we know very well that so much of economics is just completely, trying to guess what will happen if you make adjustments of different kinds. So so I've always had a chip on my shoulder because the financial sector and the industrial sectors are considered so fundamental to the destinies of a society, while the cultural sectors is considered superfluous, and when budgets get slashed, they get slashed immediately in culture. So in 2008, I was so happy. I said, okay, the emperor's new clothes. Finally, people are going to see that this is all speculation, right? And I went to the director of MoMA and I said, let's prove to the world that museums can be the R&D of society, that we are really good alternatives. If you need to trust something, better trust us than trust financial sector and Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers. And, in the end, in a few years, the speculation won everybody's hearts again, because people still do believe in this kind of strange science, pseudoscience-like diagrams. But it's funny that you brought it up, because I've always believed that it's the emperor's new clothes. What about you?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, the sort of formal isomorphism between this and the human pulse is really interesting to me, because both are seen as kind of the health of something, the health of the body, in one case the kind of economic body, in another case the human body. But the other interesting thing is in Design and Violence, we actually had a post by Gillian Tett, who's a financial writer for the Financial Times, on collateralized debt collateralized debt.
CDOs, yeah.
CDOs. What's it stand for?
Collateral
Obligations, thank you. And yeah, you can see I'm an investor. That was interesting, because also trying to think of the weaponization of financial instruments. And, I saw a lecture by one of our economists here, Will Milberg, talking about, sort of the changes in the economy over the years. And really in the 1980s, what you start to see, and probably started earlier, is you start to see that value gets detached from anything other than the kind of speculation around how you produce money from money, from value, and it no longer is tied so much to productivity, but the ways in which you can leverage financial instruments to create value where there may not be anything. And with the decoupling of the dollar from the gold standard, et cetera, we're in the sort of full Baudrillardian, simulacrum of what value and objects are, and we're in the space of just sort of circulation of signs, to use his old term. But so for me, this is a fascinating example also, because 2008 ruined a lot of people, and we're still living with that ruin. But the people that it ruined are the people who've probably made very little money since, and the people that for whom this is important are pretty much doing still fine. So great suggestion. Thank you very much for adding that. Do we have any others? So did you suggest that one? All right. So why do you think CRISPR?
I think it's kind of seen as this new possibility for maybe kind of with the ways in which design or people,
So this is a CRISPR case 9, and I'm not too familiar with it myself, but I think the possibility of kind of designers or looking at the way in which people will be able to kind of move biology and biological processes and have kind of say and kind of intentionality with them instead of just biology running its course, I think is an interesting kind of proposition that CRISPR presents.
Could you explain how CRISPR works at all?
Not at all. I think what I understand is
Can anybody
that you
explain
can.
how CRISPR works?
I think the way it works is that CRISPR. It's
sort of a gene cutting system that uses enzymes, I think, to be able to splice certain parts of the genome and kind of remake it in different ways. So it's a way of doing very surgical interruptions to the genome.
Genetic manipulation by cut and paste.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Great question. And I think a lot of people, I mean, this is the sort of, the issue that comes up in a lot of different realms. And this is also, again, work that I think the students and also Tony and Fiona pursued at the Royal College working with synthetic biologists, was to try and understand what actually are the limits of, sort of human agency when it comes to remaking the body and the human, and particularly if, as these technologies become both more successful and more sort of available and more democratized, what's that going to mean? By the way, if you ever want to look at an incredibly strange and unruly site, go look at the FAQs at DIY Bio. So this is a do-it-yourself biohacking site. And the FAQs are things like, is it a problem if I flush E. coli down the toilet? And someone else will ask, I've got a small apartment in Brooklyn and I'm culturing some, like name your disease in some like sheep culture. Is this at risk for my roommate? And you're like, oh my God, these people are like, what are they doing? And like, what are they unleashing in our society? But yeah, I mean, this is a specter of sort of godlike human kind of, agency over all that we make. And I think we can only hope that there's enough ethicists out there, and I know there aren't, to get this somewhere. I mean, we have problems even with cloning and, whether global communities of science agree on how far we should go with cloning. It turns out Barbra Streisand has a cloned set of dogs. Who knew? So this stuff gets out. Thank you very much. It was too highbrow for us. Did any others come up? So the white T-shirt.
Is it unruly though?
Who suggested the white T-shirt? Yeah.
Ooh.
Ah.
Okay, there's a bat. There's a white T-shirt.
So this one is part of, I took it from the exhibition from items. And I think, oh, sorry. So the photo, I took it from the exhibition right now, or I don't know if it's still there. And I think it's interesting because someone very powerful, like the owner of Facebook, can walk into a room with a white T-shirt and be the boss, and not necessarily having a tie and suit. So.
Yeah, that's exactly the way it was positioned in the show, so you captured it well. It was at the very end of the show, and it was like a face-off. There was the white T-shirt here facing a Savile Row suit, because the whole idea is that in this day and age, you cannot tell. If you see a man wearing a Savile Row suit and a man wearing a T-shirt, you cannot infer who the more powerful is. So from that viewpoint, yeah, it breaks pre-established rules and it sets new ones, or it opens up the field. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Rock and roll.
Yeah.
I mean, again, like the sort of, the way in which this, and actually in some ways this predates it, James Dean being the most famous example of the person who's sort of brought, and Marlon Brando, kind of pre-rock and roll, who brought the white T-shirt into the public.
She's
But it-
sending us a message.
Yes, I think so. But
Yeah.
So,
So, yes, I
Great
am
question.
sending a message. Actually, if there's one more question, perhaps we could have from the audience. Otherwise, we are going to be concluding shortly. Anybody have a question or comment? Yes, in the back.
Tag an
Oh,
image, but
sorry.
I remember last year the Guggenheim doing the art in China exhibit, and there was a huge uproar about an exhibit being taken off which involved animals in the artwork. So my question is it art, is it freedom of speech, or is it actually just plain cruel? After what we discussed today, that popped up in my mind.
Well, I
Bring art into the game. I go like this. I'm like, I don't know, because I always deal with design. So I really don't know, because it's really interesting. Artists sometimes rely on that kind of not shock value, but just like ambiguity or incisiveness of what they do. So maybe it was meant to be exactly the case, but I don't remember that much cruelty there. They were just like, it was about snakes. Was it snakes eating insects? I can't remember anymore. Yeah, but they were animals eating each other. Yeah.
yeah, you're well out of my area of expertise, so I have a lot to say. No, my sense was from the kind of art community that the museums had acted fairly shamefully, in the sense that they had backed off
Yeah.
of projects that they had supported because some people objected, and that the issues of sort of free speech and free expression were ultimately more important than the objections. That said, institutions don't have a great history when it comes to sort of listening to their others and responding in ways. So, I think we live in a really complex and turbulent time, to use the word you like, where we need to be having these fights, and we need to be having them in ways that, we may not be comfortable with. But I think that's the only way we work out some of the stuff. And I think that's part of the reason we wanted to have Design and Violence kind of open enough to have comments. We had many comments that did say, in the end, this is MoMA just taking on violence as the next new thing. And we printed them, in fact, in the book, in the catalog of it, because I think it's important to recognize that all of us have kind of limits, and all of us have blind spots, and all of us have ways of implicit bias, et cetera, that we need to be kind of open to the criticism. And we may not always act in the most dignified ways in response to it, but we have to have those.
Okay, thank you so much, Paola and
Thank you all.
Jamer, for a really
Thank you for the
fascinating
posters,
conversation.
the hashtaggers.
Martini.
Yes, cheers.
Cheers.